Okay, good morning and welcome everyone. We're really excited that you can be with us here today as part of Martin Luther King Jr. Week and our discussion of how to become a beloved community. My name is Elizabeth Kronk Warner. I have the privilege of being the Dean at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. My pronouns are she and hers. And before we launch into the discussion of today's really wonderful book, Nice Racism, How Progressive White People Perpetuate Racial Harm. I do want to start off by acknowledging that the land that I come to you today, which is in the Salt Lake Valley, is named for the Ute tribe. It's the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshu, and Ute tribes. And we here at the University of Utah recognize and respect the enduring relationship that exists between many Indigenous peoples in their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. So it seems really appropriate that we should be with you today to have this important conversation and outreach activity. And so with that brief introduction, it's really my privilege to turn it over to both my decanal colleague and now my boss, our interim Senior Vice President, Dr. Martell Teasley, who's going to kick us off to talk about this book. Dr. Teasley.
Thank you, Dean Kronk Warner, and we'll be using the first name, and so I'll call her Elizabeth and she'll call me Martell. Thank you for that introduction and welcome everyone again to Martin Luther King Week activities and our discussion on the beloved community. So we're talking about nice racism today. And I was just saying to Elizabeth, what a powerful book. The author really takes us to task. There's a lot of things that are outlined in my book and just a lot of great definitions that you may want to look at. So I would encourage everyone to get the book. I read her first book, White Fragility, and it's like, how can she top this? But I actually think this book is better in terms of talking about nice racism. And so kind of getting right into it. First, I wanted to make a disclaimer in that there are no monolithic Black people, monolithic white people, monolithic Native American people, or monolithic Asian people, etc. And so we're making some generalizations here, but it's not about all whites. It's not about all Blacks, et cetera, et cetera. I do believe racism exists in our society, structurally as well as individually. I don't believe that all white folks are racist or all Black folks are racist, but I do believe we live in this mix of a milieu that has many race-centered problems. And let me just say, for the sake of who I am, I believe that I'm a racist because I was born in America. And part of the socialization process was about race. We teach young people race. They're not born with the concept of race in them. And so that has been taught to me. That has shaped who I am as a person. And I had to deal with that as part of my identity development. And I had lots of presuppositions about other people that came in my socialization process. And whether we admit it or not, all of us do. And so that's part of a life task and life coursework for me in terms of deconstructing part of that. So I've said for probably 30, 40 years, for the rest of my life, I'll be working on getting racism out of me. And that's a big task for all of us. And so I've always wanted to open up a group, like an anti-racist group, where we do Alcoholic Anonymous, where like Alcoholic Anonymous, people stand up and say, I'm a racist, and we begin from there. And many people think that makes people feel uncomfortable because we don't want to talk about racism. And part of what the author talks about is this kind of good people, bad people binary, which she talked about in her first book. So, good people and nice people don't necessarily talk about racism. They use language that that is progressive, well-intended, and they're open-minded, and they're well-educated, and they're middle class, and they're nice. And part of the central message in the book is that being nice does not tackle the challenge of racism or the things that I talked about. And so she talks about the whole notion of being a nice racist and that there's many tactics that people do. So a little bit about good people, and then bad people, they use racist language and their overt dislike for the racial other, and the notion of bigotry, individual acts of cruelty. And so they're very easy to identify. Now, the challenge with that is that no one wants to be seen as an overt bad person or an overt racist person. And so one of the things that really captured me in the book is that she says there's no one size fits all or no one way to talk about racism within a group. And she talks about this whole notion of, I'm looking at my notes here, discourse analysis, and that there is a discourse about race and how do you gauge people within a room, within a setting. And that is pretty tough because it's how language is used, how people position themselves in a room, who sits together, who takes over the intonation, the eyes, who withdraws within the conversation, and who interrupts with sort of status quo things. And that's really very powerful in terms of how conversations take place. And I personally have a way of gauging that, engaging people. I've had no choice but to engage in rather discourse analysis or an understanding of race in my life because it has been so much, so profound in my life. I grew up in an urban area. And there were, my first job was as a newspaper solicitor in Cincinnati, Ohio, for the Cincinnati Post, a now defunct newspaper. And what I'm getting at was one day I went downtown into the main office, and as a big boy, that's really daunting. And I saw a map of the city outlined on the wall. And so I found my community that is on that map. And there was a big red line around it. And I said to my boss, why is there a red line around this area? And it was not the only area in Cincinnati, Ohio that had a red line on it. And he says, that's where we don't go. And so we solicited newspapers in all the other areas in the city, subscriptions other than those areas. Now, when I grew up and went to college, I understood that is what's called redlining. So my community was redlined. I had to walk 2 communities over to go to the bank. I had to cash my checks from my first job in a local liquor store. So no boy has no business in there doing those types of things, no 12-year-old boy. And so those were just an example, and there's many things that I grew up with in terms of racism. But when she talks about discourse analysis, that was very helpful. And she talked about racial shaming and racial guilt. And when we talk about race in different settings, and this is a person who does many activities, events, and consultations about race and culture. And she talks about racial shaming versus racial guilt. And racial shaming is an internal or private state where I feel bad. And so if within a setting, we're talking about race and a person starts to feel guilty about something and they become very emotional, and it looks like the person has attacked them. And the problem with racial shame is that it's just an internal process and it does not do anything or acknowledge the hurt or harm that someone has dealt with in terms of being a racist. And racial guilt acknowledges that we have hurt and harmed other people. And so the nice racists may more so engage in racial shame. That is, I feel so bad about this, instead of dealing with the guilt. And once we deal with the guilt, it is the notion of what should we do about it. And that is something that all of us need to deal with. As I said, I'm dealing with in my own life. There's also a lot of topics in there, and she talks about intellectualizing racism. And, both Dean Kronk Warner, Elizabeth, and I are academics, so we intellectualize lots of things. but she resonated with me when she was talking about Dr. King. And sometimes we make Dr. King so high that we can't get over him, so wide that we can't get around him, so big and magnanimous. When Dr. King died, he had about a 46% rating amongst white people in terms of likability, and only a 60% rating amongst Black folk, because he had just given the Vietnam speech where even people from the Southern Christian Leadership Coalition told him not to talk about that. And he did anyway. In other words, he was not well liked when he died. He was on the FBI's list of people to spy on in their COINTELPRO apparatus. And so now we have this great hero whose words we use in many ways, but we don't make him a human being, and we don't look at whole stories about people. And so the whole notion about intellectualizing racism is the whole notion of just talking about it, celebrating heroes and sheroes, but not really getting in the nitty gritty of it. And the thing about intellectualizing someone about like Dr. King, the problem there is that he was an everyday, ordinary person that had flaws like any other being. And once we realize that about him or anyone else, then we can see in ourselves that we can become. So it's always the process of becoming in terms of who we want to be and where we want to go. And so we should stand ready at any time. And so we can be like those heroes and sheroes. Then she talks about the concept of color denial versus color celebration. And color denial is that whole notion of color blindness, which is I don't see color, only people. Therefore, I'm really free of racism. And I don't focus on race as a dividing factor in my life. I think everything should be fair and level, and there should be no laws or anything for any particular group. And therefore, race really has no real meaning to me as a person. And so we can basically pretend to not notice racism. And that's really problematic. But color celebration is another problem. It's that, hey, I have Black friends, I have Native American friends, I have Asian friends, and we celebrate them. We celebrate our relationships with them. And that's, I've had many people who really don't know me of different racial backgrounds say to me, hey, and introduce me as a friend. And I've said, I said to myself, I just met you the other day. And that's a way of racially celebrating me. And that really doesn't work that well because people don't know me. And, my friends, I have lots of associates and affiliates, but my friends have known me for a long time and they know good and bad things about me. And so this whole notion that I have a relationship with this person because he or she or they are people of color is really problematic because it gets away from the real challenge of the work that we have to do internally in terms of discourse about race. And then there is the aversive racist. And this is a person who really finds a reason to deny that racism exists. And they really have found some rationale that fits their belief system and justifies their beliefs. It's really a form of cognitive dissonance. And so they really operate on the margins in my mind's eye. They may say things like, well, Black people are killing each other. And so why are you so worried about the police killing or shooting Black people? Because they're shooting each other. And that's very true. Black folk are doing some horrible things within urban areas because of the proliferation of guns. But I would submit if we put people in certain conditions and contexts, we'll see the same thing from other racial groups. And there's a history on that. But the challenge there also is one of not dealing with racism head on as part of who people are. And the aversive racist is a really tough nut to crack. I remember a person telling me, hey, I have many friends that are police and I have really good relationships with police, and that's really fine. It does, but what it did was take away from my own experience of law enforcement, and I've had guns pointed to my head many times when stopped by police, even when I didn't get a ticket. And so it's really very problematic. And that whole notion of aversive racism can be a really tough person to deal with because they justify what they're doing. And we're seeing a lot of that in our society today, where people operate on the margins. They find something that is problematic about something like critical race theory or diversity and inclusion, and they harp on that, and dealing with the whole subject. Let me also say that whether we're talking about critical race theory, whether we're talking about racism, whether we're talking about Black Lives Matter, any of those things, there are problematic people in all those groups. And it's easy to say that and move on, but that's not a way of being dismissive of the problem that is at hand. That serves as a way of doing that, but it doesn't get us to dealing with the problem. It just creates these really wedge positions and binary positions that really divide us. And we see a lot of that in our country. Finally, let me talk about the challenge of whiteness itself, which she touches on in the book. For one, I don't really like the words people of color. That's one of my things I really detest. Why? Because that leaves white people out. And that's a separate category of people. And all these other people are in this group called people of color. And now this term BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color. I don't really like that because, again, it separates us from our Anglo-American brothers and sisters, and it puts them in a category outside of being racialized. And once you racialize, all these other things come into play. And so then being racialized means that the minority folks have to deal with being racialized, and white folk don't need to deal with it. And that's a problem within our society. So as James Baldwin said, as long as you're white, I'm Black. In other words, as long as we keep these silly definitions from this social construct of race that we've created and operationalized and put into people's lives and created whole systems and institutions around it, then we're going to continue to have problems. So one of the first things we want to do as people is deconstruct the notion of whiteness, similar to me having to deconstruct the notion of Blackness. The three basic positions to identity. One is, who am I? Second, am I really who I say I am? And then third, am I all I ought to be? I'm going to stop right there and turn it over to my colleague.
Wonderful. Thank you, Martell. I love that challenge. So I'll start off with building on what Martell shared. My name's Elizabeth Kronk Warner, and I'm a racist. And I think that's an important place to start from. And I love his vision of a place where we can all acknowledge that, because we've all grown up and been socialized in the United States. And so we have racism implicit in all of our systems. I'm really excited to be talking about this book as part of our theme this week for the University of Utah's MLK events, the beloved community, because the book really points to important work that needs to be done in order to be a beloved community, because it talks about these less insidious daily things that happen for those of us who identify as non-white, and how that can negatively impact our environment. And so I think it's a really important discussion. And just as an aside, I love the call of action to be part of a beloved community. I saw that there was a question that came in, and I encourage you all to send in questions. We want to leave plenty of time to have a discussion. But somebody said, I can't stay long because I have another class, but I was wondering why this book was chosen when taking in consideration the controversy about the first book and the author. I have not read either book, but from the criticism of the first book and the topic of the second book seems that the author has not acknowledged the criticism of the first book. So unfortunately, I'm not sure what criticism you're referring to, but I'd be happy to speak to why we chose this book. So as Martell mentioned in his comments, and is true for me as well, this book really impacted both of us. And as he mentioned, and it's true for me too, basically every page has something underlined or highlighted in it, because this is the reality in terms of the world and the life that I, certainly speaking for myself, live, in terms of daily things that happen and that happen over and over again. And so, at least speaking for myself, I thought it would be a great conversation to have. Also, one of the things about the author that is somewhat unique is that she is white and she writes her books specifically to talk to other white individuals. And I think that that's an important positionality for us at the University of Utah, given that we are a PWI, a primary white serving institution. And so that's an important conversation for us to have. That being said, this is the second of her books that we've read. I was sharing with somebody that we were reading this again, and he said, "Oh, you must really like Robin DiAngelo." And I thought, oh, well, I hope people don't think that we're privileging her over non-white authors who are equally as important. Again, at least speaking for myself, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this book is because of the positionality of the University of Utah and our community and what our community looks like. So with that in place, do want to talk just some personal reflections and then dive into some of the issues that really struck me about the book. So as a white presenting Native, so I am a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians, but I also acknowledge that most people, when they see me for the first time, see me as somebody who is white. I really live in two worlds. And so I experienced this book in two different ways. So I experience it both as someone who is constantly encountering the microaggressions, the nice racism that she's talking about the book. So I can give you an example of that. I've worked at several institutions before the University of Utah. And at one of the institutions I previously worked at, a colleague and I were talking about racism and racism in the classroom. And this colleague said to me, "I don't want to call out students for being racist because I don't want to shame them." And I think that would be inappropriate. And it actually made me really mad because in the back of my head, I thought, well, one, this is a perfect example of nice racism, right? We're going to somehow allow for intellectual discussion about racism, which is going to make non-white students very uncomfortable in the classroom and also potentially allow for racism to persist. But also I thought if somebody had called her, think of some nasty word about a woman, she would probably address it on the spot. So why are we not shaming students or not talking about racism in the classroom? And that is just an example of something that happens almost on a daily basis since I've been in the academy. So I certainly relate to a lot of the examples in this book, and they're things that I myself have experienced. But also I acknowledge that because I am white presenting and so light skinned, I am one of the people who benefits from the privileges of appearing white that she talks about in this book, and how systemic racism allows for those of us who are white presenting to benefit. So the book is really interesting, thought-provoking for me as someone who both is frustrated with microaggressions and nice racism, but also acknowledges and recognizes that I benefit from systemic racism because of my white presenting identity. And I really like her push, and Martell said this as well, to challenge our complicity. And how are we complicit in those privileges that we receive as being white presenting? Ultimately, I think the hard thing about this work is that it's not about us. It's not about whether we're good intentioned. It's not about, as she says, what's true in our heart and who we ideally are. It's how other people are experiencing us. And so I think I really like the fact that she's constantly challenging us to think about that. I also want to acknowledge one of the things that hit me hard about the book and has been my own experience is that it's really hard not to be defensive. So as I started out, as Martell mentioned, we both acknowledge our own racism, and I have made mistakes in my career. I have said things that have been deeply hurtful to others in my community. And it's really easy to immediately go to a place of, I didn't mean it that way. I was really being thoughtful. I'm not a bad person. It's really easy to get defensive. But again, it's not about you. It's not about us. It's not about the person that did it. It's about how others are experiencing you and what you're doing to the community. And so it's very hard not to be defensive, but ultimately at the end of the day, that's what I think we have to strive towards. I really love that Maya Angelou quote where she says, do the best you can until you know better. And when you know better, do better. And that goes back to Martell's point that this is when he said that this is something that he's going to be working on his entire life. We joke a little bit at the College of Law. We've adopted equity, diversity, and inclusion and creating a belonging environment as one of our goals for the college. And our joke is that we have picked a goal that we will never achieve, because we always have to do a little bit better. But that's nice, right? That we can constantly be working on ourselves and constantly be trying to do better. I think we also need to think about anti-racism as a skill, that you need to practice it to do better. I really like that she talked about that. So I mentioned earlier that I have made mistakes in my own career. I have said things that were harmful and hurtful to others, for which I'm terribly sorry. And it's also really easy. Not only is it easy to get defensive when that happens, it's also really easy to want to put your head in the sand and to say, I'm not going to do this work anymore. All I get is flack and negative pushback, but we can't do that. And at page 38, she says, the vast majority of racist acts perpetuated daily by white progressives are neither conscious nor intentional. And that's why we have to constantly be pushing ourselves and constantly be thinking about how we can do better and practicing this skill. Because if we just stop talking about race and racism, our skills, our abilities will never get better, right? It's like skiing. If you fall down a couple of times and you just stop skiing, you're never going to get better at skiing. So it's something that we just have to constantly be working at and at doing better. She also says that that personal transformation is an act of anti-racism. And I love that. This idea that if we work on getting better, if we work at kind of flexing our skill of talking about racism and thinking about how to respond to allegations of racism, that will ultimately make us better. And that in and of itself is an anti-racism step. So I really encourage us to think about that. Also, I want to point out that saying that somebody is racist or that an act is racist is not the same as saying somebody's immoral. And I see those two intertwined. And I think that's really why it's really important for me to say, I'm a racist. And it's something I have to work on and constantly work on. Do I think I'm an immoral or bad person? No. But do I think that I grew up in a society with embedded and systemic racism and that I benefit from that racism? Yes. And so do I have to constantly challenge myself? Yes. And so that's not the same thing. And I think people really struggle because when they hear the word racism, or when they hear what you did was racist, or you're acting in a racist way, what they hear is that you're calling them immoral. And the two are not the same. They're absolutely not the same. You can be a good person and still make a mistake and still say or do something that's racist. And that's, I think, really at the core of her book and what she's challenging people to think about. Since this is Martin Luther King Jr. week, I thought we would start with her, or at least acknowledge what she says about the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., which is on page 3. And she says that the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., among others, critiqued what he terms the white moderate more than 50 years ago. So this is not a new concept. In positioning the moderate in relation to the far end of the spectrum, the Klansman, he would be speaking about today's white progressives in relation to white nationalists. We claim to support racial justice efforts, but want to suppress the tensions that accompany achieving that goal. In a letter from Brigham Jail, written in 1963, when he was in prison for protesting racial segregation, King observed that white moderates play a fundamental, albeit implicit, part in the resistance to racial equality. Now, I'm going to read this quote from the letter, and there are words, the word Negro is used, which of course is an offensive word, but that is the word that's used in this quote, and so I'm going to use it. Martin Luther King Jr. says, I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, when in the absence of tension to the positive peach, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. So King here speaks to the tendency of white moderates to see a lack of struggle as the indicator of racial justice. And so I thought that was really appropriate given our celebrations this week. And she encouraged us to think about how does race shape our life? And she encourages us to do this work of reflection, which is on page 12 and 13. And there's a really nice list here. And I have to say, this list struck me because a lot of these things is my lived reality. So she says, did you grow up in an integrated neighborhood? If so, do you still live in one? And if not, you do now, is it due to gentrification? So speaking for myself, I do not live in a diverse neighborhood right now. If you did not grow up in an integrated neighborhood, why didn't you? If everyone is equal, how did you make sense of living separately? Did your parents encourage you to visit the places where Black people lived in order to get to know them and build the relationships that were missing in your environment? Did your parents have a significant number of Black friends themselves? Did you attend integrated schools? If so, was your school considered to be good? Did you study systemic racism in your K through 12 education? I certainly did not. I didn't even know what Juneteenth was until about 5 years ago. And I graduated from Ivy League University not 5 years ago. So this is definitely part of our education. If you graduate from college, did you study systemic racism there? Was it integrated throughout your education by your professors, including your Black professors? Reflecting on this, I can't think of a single Black professor that I had when I was in college. Or were your professors overwhelmingly white? Did those white professors have to demonstrate that they were able to engage with issues of racism in the curriculum and classroom dynamics before they were considered qualified to teach? Did you have to demonstrate that you had a foundational understanding of racism before you could graduate or teach, manage people, or practice medicine or law? No. Speaking for the legal field, no. If you were not educated about racism, have you sought every or even an opportunity to gain the education yourself? This is something that I'm now working on, but later in life. Do you work in an organization in which Black people are represented at all levels, including the top? Well, now that my boss is Martell, we've made some progress there, but certainly not before that. Does your workplace profess to value diversity in their marketing materials and vision statement? If so, is the executive leadership team held accountable to racially equitable outcomes in their policies and practices? If you were married and you showed me your wedding album, would I see how integrated your friendship circle is? So again, just some questions that I think when we take the time to ask those of ourselves, they're really impactful. I'll leave with, again, this idea that personal transformation is an act of anti-racism. And she points out that racism is everyone's problem. I think sometimes we want to say that racism is a problem for those who are non-white and leave it to individuals who are not white to solve the problem. But as Ibram Kendi says, even if you have not been a producer of racism, there's a good chance that you've been a consumer of racism. So for example, when I walk into spaces, I'm automatically admitted, I think likely because I have light skin, where people who have darker skin do not experience that. So I benefit from my light skin color on almost a daily basis. And that's certainly been my experience. And then again, if you look at page 45 to 46, she talks about some examples of nice racism. And so I really encourage you to take a look at that because I really like that she gives a list of what she's talking about. So things like confusing one person for another of the same racial group, expecting people of color, and I know I recognize Martell's concern with that term, but to be interested and skilled at doing any work related to race. So for example, in my world, as I mentioned, I'm Native, I cannot think of a single Indian who is teaching in law schools who does not teach Indian law. So there's just a presumption that because we're Indian, we must want to teach Indian law and we must be experts in Indian law. And we don't make space for others who might not fall in that mold. Bringing up an unrelated racial topic while talking to a person of color. I know I certainly find myself doing this because I want people to know that I'm a good person and I get it. And so I'll just bring it up gratuitously. Denying, being defensive, explaining away, seeking absolution when confronted with having enacted racism. Again, I already mentioned just how hard that was for me when I personally have been called out for some of my activities. And so I know that it's very hard to do. So I encourage you to take a look at that list and to really reflect on it, because I think, at least speaking for myself, several things on that list I have done or have actively seen in my life. And so I think it's really powerful to reflect on that list. So I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for our questions. Before I do so, Martell, did you have anything else to add before we go to questions?
Just a little bit. When she talks about strategies for addressing racism, that was really profound to me, because there's no one size fits all, and that we have to gauge where we're at. And so what may work in one setting may not work in another. And she talked about her own plight and her work where she had a standard practice of being in settings and really taking white people to task, particularly white women. And it has worked for her, but she was called out on that and got very defensive at the time, and later realized the harm or the problem that she had in her presentation. And so this is a person basically saying, I'm continuing to work on myself, as I talked about before. But she talks about the approach to racism as and the challenge of thoughtfulness. And so I'm going to be very thoughtful and pragmatic about racism. But and that's fine. We should be thoughtful. So if someone said to me a particular racial thing, I could say, given this the context, the person, understand something about the socialization process of that person, maybe I should let them off the hook. Let me give you an example of that. So I live in a gated community. I'll confess to that, and nothing wrong with that. But one day, about 2 years ago, my wife and I were going to get a new key to the swimming pool because it's locked and you have to be a resident. And so I was walking down the street and I saw a lady, and she said, well, where are you going? And I said, well, I'm going down here to get the key on this street. And she said, no, that's back up there. And she pointed the other way towards the gate. And I said, actually, no, it's down here. And it actually happened to be the house next to hers. And so she was walking in the same direction. And she turned to me and said, well, okay, the reason I told you that because a Black person stole something from me. Now, for me, this lady looked every bit of 80 with silver hair, etc., and all the attributes of a senior citizen. And I thought, this is an old white lady who has probably not been socialized around Blacks, so I'm just going to smile. My wife was livid. She did not like that and really wanted to say something. And which approach is best? You know, she was really hot. She did not like that. And I basically asked her not to say anything to the lady, and she's wanted to lie into her. But the notion of thoughtfulness can be problematic in some situations where we let people off the hook. And then we can take that to the extreme and be what Robin DiAngelo calls being careful all the time. And that can make us disingenuous and let people go on with racial rants or racial happenstances that happen and not correct them. And that's very problematic. And that's easy to do in particular settings where you don't want to be the one that calls out a person. And that is really challenging. And so you have to engage the strategies where you're at in different settings. And then she talks about white silence as a very thoughtful practice. And I must say, and even here at the U, and I will confess, I'm sometimes and many times the only Black person in the room. And sometimes eyes roll my way when an instance of racism comes up. And I can see the power dynamics in the room. Some people are very reserved and silent. Some people are basically hinting to me that you need to say something. And sometimes I feel compelled to say something. What I have said to my colleagues, and they're responding appropriately, and I've said this to Elizabeth, I need assistance. Don't be silent, you know. And, she has said to me, hey, you're right about that. And others have said that. And so people have said, you won't be alone in such settings. We'll be standing there by you. And I've really felt that way, particularly in recent days when we've had tough conversations about race. And so that's been very helpful, but we still have a long way to go. Now, so let's go to the question. So here's one that says, racism is such a loaded term. And as the book states, no one wants to be labeled racist. This fact makes it difficult to talk about it or to enact change. What systemic change can the University of Utah put in place to help all people understand their own racial bias and the impact it has on everyone? Really good question, really tough question. I don't have a total answer. Let me say a couple of things. One is this, you're certainly right. People don't like to be called racist. We could be labeled a lot of things: late, uncareful, unthoughtful, gender bias. That's a problem too. But if we're called a racist, we don't like that, because it's okay for people in many ways to live in a racist society, because that is the system itself. And it's so big, so wide, we can hardly get around it. But when we say that we're individually racist, we don't really like that, because then that gets into individual responsibility. And so that means that the person has to do something about that. And so we do everything to get that label off of us. And we apologize. We may become very defensive, but if it can become proactive. But as Elizabeth was saying, it's okay to, and as I've said, it's okay to understand that we have racist tendencies in us in the socialization process. I think each of us really need to examine how we were socialized. I became a dorm director in graduate school, and it was like the first time I realized that around fluent Black people who were there at the school, same university, they didn't necessarily have a kinship to me. They've had racialized experience, but their experience was a suburban one, and mine was urban. And so it's quite different. So what can the University of Utah do? One, I think individually, we need to talk to people that are unlike us. So I can get in circles with African Americans, particularly African American men, and really chop it up about the racism that we experience. But it's another thing to talk to non-Black people about racialized experience and have that discourse with them. And that takes some time. It's a way of getting to know people. Sometimes it is being very thoughtful, waiting for the right moment. But then there is the need, as my wife felt that day, to do some on-the-spot corrections with people. Now, let's please realize, and she talks about this in the book, many of us have trauma from racism. And if we haven't dealt with that trauma, we can become explosive when something reminds us of an instance that was racist in our lives and caused us that trauma. And so that person really hasn't healed, and they may not be in the best place to deal with racism. It's sort of like veterans who have PTSD. They know they can't get in certain circles. I'm a veteran myself. I've been to war. I didn't realize how being in war impacted me. And I kept saying I was fine until one day I was cleaning up something and I found a photo album from when I was in the first Gulf War. And just touching it set trepidation through my entire body. And I realized the impact that going to war had on me at that moment, and that I was in denial for a long time. So the University of Utah is doing things. There are dialogues that are taking place. I really love the King celebration, but I think we need to individually do things. There is a proposal that I've written for an Institute on Race, Policy Studies, and Health Equity. And let's hope that gains some traction. So we need to do quite a few other things. I proposed to the president that we have a Martin Luther King Award on campus for faculty and staff. There are student awards, and we need to have a dialogue about this on a regular basis. But it's getting harder. Why do I say that? Because the legislature right now is attempting to pass a bill where you can't talk about critical race theory, and you can't say anything to people about race that makes them feel uncomfortable. And not only that, the United States Congress is attempting to do the same thing. Someone's proposing a bill there. And so as far as we come, we have these pushbacks, because part of this is the socialization process. And in my mind's eye, we're going to have greater problems in the future. Why? Well, people can be sued in the state of Oklahoma for having librarians can be sued in the state of Oklahoma for having certain books on the shelf that may cause trepidation to young people who may read them. And so they have to take the books off the shelf. Many award-winning books like Toni Morrison's Beloved have been banned from libraries. And in the state of Texas, where my wife comes from, where we will move back once my time here at the University of Utah is done, there is lots of banning of books there. And while we're not burning them, banning them is just as problematic. So if we have a problem with the socialization process now, where certain people don't talk about race and not oriented to race, and they're told that we're all equal with these narratives that we have in history, and that we've overcome everything, particularly after our plight in the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement. If we have that narrative and we start to ban books, it's going to be much more challenging in the future. I'll give way to you right now, Elizabeth.
Wonderful. Thank you. I agree, and just have a couple of things to add. Yes, you're spot on. These are difficult topics. And I want to acknowledge that I've only been comfortable with saying that I'm a racist once I obtained a level of privilege in my work environment. So I want to acknowledge that I'm comfortable saying I'm a racist, but I'm also in a position where the worst thing that happens to me is if I lose my deanship, I go back to being a tenured faculty member, which is a pretty nice job. I'm actually convinced is the best job. And so I acknowledge that I'm in a really privileged position in terms of my career. And so that's part of the reason why I feel comfortable talking about this and acknowledging my own mistakes and acknowledging my own racism. But I think a piece of it is that we have to socialize and normalize talking about it. We have to normalize saying things like, I'm a racist. It's very similar to the mental health space, right? So similarly, I have PTSD, which goes back to some racial and sexual trauma that I encountered about 20 years ago. And I think it's really important to say, I have PTSD, I have anxiety, to normalize these things. There's nothing wrong with it, and to talk about it openly. And so I don't think when you ask what the you can do, I don't think there's one thing. There's not a silver bullet. There's not a panacea. There's not, if we do this, racism will go away, because it is embedded. I firmly believe that it is embedded in our society. But if we are willing to acknowledge it and willing to acknowledge where we are not experts. So the most recent incident of where I made a mistake involved LGBTQ rights and language. And I realized I made a mistake, and I reached out to experts on campus to help educate myself. And so I think when you don't make a mistake, the number one thing that we can do as individuals, and it really starts at the individual level, is try to be reflective and try to acknowledge when we made a mistake, and then to do better. It goes back to that Maya Angelou quote that I love so much. We do the best we can, but eventually we find that we can do better. And then educating ourselves, not leaning on non-white individuals to educate us, educating ourselves about how we can do better. And so I think if we start at an individual level, that'll trickle up, if you will. And then, of course, we have wonderful leaders like Martell, President Randall, who are very much engaged in this topic and trying to do larger institutional things. But as individuals, we can really work on ourselves, and that'll make a huge difference. The second thing is to not be scared to say when something seems racist. It goes back to what Martell was saying that, and I've been in those meetings where everybody kind of turns and looks at Martell. Like, what are you going to say? To not leave it to our non-white colleagues. If you think something is wrong, if you perceive that members of our community are uncomfortable with something that's being said or done, speak up. Don't leave it to others to have to be the ones to carry that burden. And normalize talking about race and racism. And that's part of the reason why it's really important to me to talk about when I make mistakes, is partially to empower other members of my community so that when and if they make a mistake, they feel comfortable talking about it. Or when and if they see somebody else making a mistake, they feel comfortable talking about it. And so I think those are some things, some little things that we can do to make a difference. And then I see we have another question that says, a few sincerely and curiously asked questions. Dean Kronk Warner, the idea, it's not about us, it's about how others respond to us, seems contradictory to accountability inherent in our legal system and moral reasoning. Does the degree of hurt from a person victimized in a crime weigh more than the nature of the crime? And then number 2, SVP Teasley, what language would you use in place of BIPOC that would be more inclusive? And how would you introduce the idea of not using the term BIPOC? Thanks. So I'll answer my question and then I'll turn it over to Martell. So in terms of the contradiction that you're pointing out, I don't necessarily disagree with that. I'm, of course, when I speak about this, and her book is not talking about the criminal justice system, is talking about kind of daily life. And I'm certainly thinking about it in terms of our community at the University of Utah and what we can do in terms of our community. I will say our criminal justice system, in my opinion, is deeply flawed, and that our system of retribution is deeply flawed and has been shown to be not the right system, right? We've only seen things worsen. Things have not gotten better. And in my tribal communities, we actually, instead of retribution, use restorative justice, where we try to work with the members who have committed crimes or who have had transgressions to return them to the community as a whole person and to repair the community. I actually worked as a healing to wellness tribal judge for the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation and found this work wonderfully. Rather than just throw people away and incarcerate them and separate them from society, we would come together, and it wasn't just me as the judge, it was social workers, it was technical job operations individuals to help retrain. And we would work with people to bring them back, to kind of go deep into why they were committing crimes, and then to restore them, right? Restorative justice, and to restore them to the community. And we had a far better success rate. We had over 70% success rate in terms of reducing recidivism than the state judicial system. So I don't necessarily disagree with you, not talking in terms of the criminal justice system, talking in terms of daily life. But in terms of our criminal justice system, and that could be a whole nother topic, I think that it is fundamentally flawed and would love to see more of a restorative justice system than a retributive system. Martell, your question on BIPOC.
So yes, and let me also say I really would like to see more restorative justice, even in the university system, because there's some very basic questions. It's like, what harm have you caused people? And how do you think that made that person feel? How does that make you feel? And what should you do for accountability? And I just would love to see our system move more so to that. Now, when we do certain things, certainly there are criminal charges that can take place. But for some low level of things, those are better approaches. Now, in terms of BIPOC, I think we should call people who they are. So I'm an African American, which really says that part of my history is in Africa and part of it's in America. And then when we talk about Native Americans, not only do they, Native American is an appropriate term, but what tribe are you from? And what group are you affiliated with? That centers and locates people in terms of who they are. And that's important to do. instead of dumping people. But if we had to have, and for writing, we don't write out all these terms. So we started with BIPOC, but I really don't like that. I like the term minoritized because what that does is it talks about the oppression that people experience and being labeled minority groups. Now, we're certainly moving to a situation where certainly quote unquote people of color in general, and I said I don't like that term, will outnumber our Anglo-American brothers and sisters here in this country, but they will still be minoritized because of the lack of wealth and the lack of power and the lack of not just necessarily access, but I want to say control, but that's too strong of a word in terms of major institutions in our society. And so that will continue to minoritize groups and oppress them in certain ways. So for example, should the laws in certain states where voting rights are being questioned, if they're enacted, that will be extremely oppressive to minoritized populations, and it will set us back. Let me go with another question here. Many of my professors were Asian and language was a barrier. How do we deal with that issue of racism? I wouldn't say that the professors were racist because they were Native, because they were Asian or Asian descent. One, let's celebrate that they're bilingual more than likely. That's why they have an accent. And I speak a little Ebonics and English, but no other language. So I'm always in admiration of people who are bilingual or multilingual, and that's a problem within our country. I think in that case, and I've had that experience myself in the college classroom, to be frank with you, I think what we can do is go to the professor's office though, make sure we read the books and make sure we get a good understanding. And what often happens if we really are good listeners and a person has an accent, we start to adjust and understand their linguistic patterns. So listening is extremely important. Instead of the stereotype, this is an Asian person and what are they doing in front of us? That notion itself is a racist notion. So let me go to this other question. So much of this is ignorance on her part, and I think we're talking about the writer. Many Utahns live in majority white neighborhoods because their ancestors were the victims of horrific prejudice themselves and had to travel to 2,000 miles. There weren't a lot of Black people in the Great Basins, was there? Not every disparity or perceived segregation is driven by white people being prejudiced. Let me be clear about something. You're right about that. And so the challenges that Mormon folks experience, particularly in the Northeast and their travel to this area, that story is well known. And it's a great story. But in terms of African Americans, please remember, they were kept out of this area. And that's why the population is so low. And so we've got to read some different books. So for example, in Oregon, for example, when there was the Great Migration to the West, there was purposeful keeping out of Black people in terms of homesteading. They weren't part of homesteading in this area. They could not do so. They were kept out by whites. In Oregon, for example, when people started to move west, they had a small percentage of population that were African American. First, they said no other African Americans could come. And then in the 1860s, I can't remember the year, they passed a law saying that Black people needed to leave. And if they didn't leave, they would get flogged every year. So we don't know the history there. And then please remember that there were Native Americans in the area as well as our Hispanic brothers and sisters. And we don't talk about what happened there in terms of reducing that population over time. And so as we understand the history of one group and the struggles that they have, please realize that there were struggles that other groups have. And we don't want to not acknowledge the challenge that poor whites have had and the challenges that whites have had in many areas, particularly of our Mormon brothers and sisters. But that does not usurp the challenge of race and racism today that still exists with us. And so the one thing in this notion of this great change of being was the notion of Blackness, and that the lowest people were Black people. And still in this country, the people who has less wealth are the people with the most West African DNA in them. And geneticists have proved that. If we look at the distribution of wealth, none of that has been by happenstance. That has been purposeful. Elizabeth?
Yes, I would just add on to that. I encourage everyone to take a look at the website Mapping Inequality. It shows how major cities and communities were redlined, and you can see maps of Salt Lake City, and you can see the redlining in Salt Lake City that occurred. And if you look at those historical redline maps and layer them over where the pockets of lower socioeconomic distribution in our city, and also where the environmental justice concerns exist, right? So in Salt Lake City, we have environmental justice concerns because we have a pollution line. And if you look at the cost of housing below that pollution line, it's much less expensive than above the pollution line. And who is more likely to live below the pollution line? Non-white racialized individuals. So I really encourage you to look at those maps, those red line maps, to see how our own communities were historically situated, and to think about Salt Lake City, again, just using where we're currently at as an example to think about. And one last thought, because I know we're at time. There are a couple of questions coming from faculty of what we can do. Whatever you do, I encourage you to educate yourself, to work on doing better, to take up Maya Angelou's kind of challenge of do better. And when you know better, do even better. I know I just got that wrong, but don't stay silent, because silence is the tool of the oppressor. And your students, if you're silent and don't say anything, they're going to interpret it as racism. And that's likely not what you mean. So work on building that tool, work on engaging in those conversations, and keep moving forward. And know that you're going to make a mistake. Own it, apologize for it, and move forward. Do not stop doing this work. Do not stop having these conversations. And it's only through that type of individual effort that we can really start to chip away at systemic racism in our society. So with that, again, I know we're over time. This was a wonderful conversation. We really appreciate you. We really appreciate your excellent questions. If you have any questions of us, always feel free to reach out to us at any time. You can find us at the University of Utah's website, and we'll look for another book to discuss, and I'm sure we'll be back in a couple of months. And we encourage you in the meantime, there are many other wonderful events happening as part of our Martin Luther King Week and becoming a beloved community. And so we encourage you to participate in those as well. Martell, last word?
Well, last words is the words of Dr. King, who said, "I can't be what you want me to be until you become what I want you to be. And you can't be what I want you to be until I become what you want me to be." And that's the essence of reciprocity and the essence of the beloved community. Thank you so much for your time. We'll see you next time.